Stale sweat, expensive cologne, and impending violence choked the boardroom air. When Gabriel Cross pointed to the empty leather chair directly at his right hand and commanded, "Sit here," the room went dead silent. That seat was the line of fire. So I did what any sane woman employed by a high-functioning psychopath would do. I chose the chair one seat over. Gabriel didn't yell. He didn't blink. He just stood, clamped a heavy hand onto my chair, and physically dragged me, wood, leather, and all, flush against his side. Clara Bennett did not believe in monsters, but she believed in spreadsheets. Spreadsheets were rational. They tracked the intake of illegal gambling revenues from the South Side. They monitored the payoffs to the 4th Precinct, and they calculated the depreciation of the armored SUVs the company purchased every fiscal quarter. She worked for Gabriel Cross. On paper, Gabriel was the CEO of Cross Logistics, a mid-sized shipping conglomerate operating out of Chicago. Off paper, he was the man you went to when you needed 3 tons of untraceable cargo moved across state lines, or when you needed a rival syndicate dismantled down to the studs. Clara was his executive secretary. She was 28, chronically overtired, and severely underpaid for the amount of felonies she inadvertently witnessed. She stayed because the health insurance covered her mother's dialysis, and because Gabriel Cross, for all his cold-blooded tendencies, offered a strange kind of corporate stability. He didn't scream. He didn't throw things. He just dismantled people's lives with a quiet, terrifying efficiency. It was a Tuesday afternoon, raining hard enough to blur the Chicago skyline into a smudge of grey sludge. The boardroom on the 42nd floor was packed. Clara stood near the door, holding a tablet pressed against her chest like a shield. The men at the table were not the usual mid-level managers. These were the capos from the Western syndicates. They wore suits that cost more than Clara's car, but they wore them poorly. They sat with their legs splayed, their knuckles thick and scarred, their eyes darting around the minimalist glass-walled room like trapped wolves. They smelled of wet wool and cheap aggression. Gabriel sat at the head of the long oak table. He wore a charcoal suit, perfectly tailored, devoid of wrinkles. His dark hair was neatly parted. He looked like a Wall Street banker, right down to the gold tie clip. But his eyes gave him away. They were a flat, pale hazel. When he looked at people, he didn't seem to see humanity. He saw structural weaknesses. "The shipping routes through the docks are non-negotiable, Arthur," Gabriel said. His voice was a low rumble, barely rising above the hum of the air conditioning. Arthur, a heavy-set man with a flushed face and a thick neck, slammed his palm flat against the oak. "You're taking 30%, Cross. That's extortion. We used to pay 15. Inflation," Gabriel said simply. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flinch at the loud noise. He just turned his head slightly. "Clara." "The minutes." Clara stepped forward, her heels clicking loudly against the polished concrete floor. The sound felt deafening in the tense silence. She walked toward the table. There were 2 empty chairs to Gabriel's right. "Sit here," Gabriel commanded softly, tapping the polished wood of the table directly in front of the chair right next to him. Clara froze. In the intricate, unspoken geometry of Mafia sit-downs, the seat directly to the right of the boss was a focal point. It was where you put your second in command. It was the chair the opposition looked at when they wanted to intimidate. More importantly, if someone decided to pull a weapon from beneath the table, the immediate radius around Gabriel Cross was the drop zone. Clara was a civilian. She was a secretary. She took notes and ordered the dark roast coffee. She looked at Gabriel. He wasn't looking at her. His flat, pale eyes were locked on Arthur. Clara swallowed hard. Her survival instincts, honed by 3 years in a high-rise filled with sociopaths, kicked in. She bypassed the chair Gabriel had tapped and pulled out the second chair, the one a safe 3 feet away. She sat down, smoothing her pencil skirt, and opened her tablet. "Ready, Mr. Cross?" Arthur grinned, a nasty, predatory showing of yellowed teeth. A murmur of amusement rippled through the opposing men. A boss whose own secretary didn't obey his exact physical commands looked weak. It was a microscopic fracture in Gabriel's armor, but in this room, microscopic fractures got people killed. Gabriel stopped talking. The silence stretched, turning heavy and suffocating. Clara kept her eyes glued to the glowing screen of her tablet, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Just take the notes," she told herself. "Just keep your head down." Gabriel slowly pushed his chair back. The scrape of the legs against the concrete sounded like a gunshot. He stood up. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely blank. He walked the 3 feet to where Clara sat. He didn't ask her to move. He didn't offer a hand. He stepped behind her, clamped his large, heavy hands down on the armrests of her leather chair, and hoisted it up just a fraction of an inch off the ground. Clara let out a short, involuntary gasp as the world shifted. With a single fluid motion of brute upper body strength, Gabriel dragged her chair backward, slid it to the left, and slammed it down flush against his own. The leather of her armrest squeaked sharply against the leather of his. He sat back down. Their thighs were separated by less than an inch of space. The heat radiating off him was palpable, cutting through the sterile chill of the boardroom. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She could smell the faint scent of cedar wood and the ozone tang of the rain on his jacket. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, casually bridging the tiny gap between them so his shoulder brushed hers. He didn't look at her. "As I was saying, Arthur," Gabriel continued, his voice unchanged, his tone perfectly level. 30%, and if you slam your hand on my table again, I'll have someone remove it from your wrist." The amusement died instantly in Arthur's eyes. The room went cold. Clara stared at her tablet, her fingers trembling slightly as she began to type. She was now in the line of fire, and for the first time in 3 years, Gabriel Cross had pulled her directly into it. The meeting lasted another 47 minutes. Clara knew exactly how long it was because she watched the digital clock in the corner of her tablet tick down every agonizing second. Gabriel did not move away from her. The proximity was overwhelming. He was a large man, and his presence occupied entirely too much gravity in the room. Every time he shifted, the fabric of his suit whispered against her sleeve. He emanated a quiet, coiled tension. Clara took the minutes with mechanical precision, translating veiled threats into clean, corporate vernacular. Arthur disagrees with the revenue split. Arthur threatened to burn down the South Side warehouse. Mr. Cross remains firm on the new structure. Gabriel suggested Arthur's son might have a sudden, fatal accident. When it was over, the Western syndicates filed out, their posture stiff, their faces pale. Arthur was the last to leave, shooting a venomous glare at Gabriel and a lingering, calculating look at Clara. It made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Once the heavy glass doors clicked shut, Clara exhaled a long, shaky breath. She immediately reached for the lever under her chair to slide away, to re-establish the professional boundary that kept her sane. Gabriel's hand shot out. His fingers closed lightly around her wrist. Clara froze. His skin was warm, his grip loose but entirely immovable. She finally turned to look at him. Up close, the pale hazel of his eyes had flecks of dark green. He looked exhausted, the faint purple shadows under his eyes betraying the brutal hours he kept. "Don't move yet," he said. His voice was quieter now, stripped of the performative edge he used for the capos. "The meeting is over, Mr. Cross," Clara said, trying to keep her tone brisk. She pulled her arm back. He let her go instantly. "Arthur is leaving 2 of his men in the lobby," Gabriel stated, leaning back in his chair and rubbing the bridge of his nose. They're waiting to see who comes out first, to gauge the temperature. I have quarterly reports to file. I'll take the service elevator. No. Gabriel dropped his hand. He turned his head to look at her fully. You're done for the day. You're riding with me. Clara's stomach plummeted. That isn't necessary. I take the L train. It's faster. Clara, he said. It was the first time in a month he had used her first name. It sounded strange coming from his mouth. Too human, too sharp. Arthur wasn't looking at me when he made that comment about the 15%. He was looking at you. He noticed you pulling away from me. He read it as dissension. In his world, a man who cannot command his own secretary is a man losing his grip. I just didn't want to be in the way, she lied smoothly. Gabriel let out a short, hollow sound that might have been a laugh. You didn't want to be in the splash zone. You're pragmatic, Miss Bennet. It's why I hired you. But pragmatism just put a target on your back. Arthur thinks you're a weak link he can exploit. Clara felt a cold sweat break out along her spine. I just type spreadsheets. You type my spreadsheets, he corrected softly. He stood up, buttoning his jacket. Get your coat. 10 minutes later, Clara was sitting in the back of Gabriel's armoured Lincoln Navigator. The windows were tinted black, creating a claustrophobic cocoon. The rain lashed against the heavy glass, sounding muted and distant. Gabriel sat beside her. He hadn't pulled her close this time. He sat on his side of the leather bench, staring out the window at the blurred city lights. The silence stretched. Clara stared at her hands in her lap. She was acutely aware of the locked doors, the thick bulletproof glass, the armed driver in the front seat, separated by a soundproof partition. She was entirely at Gabriel's mercy, swallowed whole by the machine he had built to protect himself. I didn't pull you closer to punish you, Gabriel said suddenly, without turning away from the window. Clara looked up. You undermined my autonomy in a room full of dangerous men. Gabriel finally turned his head. His expression was grim. I claimed you in a room full of dangerous men. There is a difference. I don't belong to you, Mr. Cross. I work for you. To Arthur, it is the same thing, Gabriel replied smoothly. By distancing yourself, you signaled you were expendable. I had to prove you weren't. Why? Clara asked, the cynical edge of her voice sharpening. Because replacing a secretary who knows Excel macros is a hassle. Gabriel's jaw tightened. He looked at her, really looked at her, his eyes dropping to the pulse beating rapidly at the base of her throat, then back up to her face. Because I don't let things that are mine get broken, Clara. Even if they fight me on it. The words hung in the air, thick and heavy, carrying a weight Clara refused to unpack. She turned her head away, watching the neon signs of the city bleed through the rain-streaked glass. She wasn't an idiot. She knew the reality of men like Gabriel. They didn't love, they possessed. And right now, she was just an asset he was protecting from a hostile takeover. Or so she tried to convince herself. As the dark, quiet heat of his stare lingered on the side of her face for the rest of the drive, Clara lived in a neighborhood that gentrification had forgotten. It was a grid of cracked sidewalks, flickering street lamps, and narrow pre-war apartment buildings that smelled perpetually of boiled cabbage and old dust. It was cheap, and it was anonymous. The armored Lincoln idled at the curb. An alien spaceship dropped into a slum. Thank you for the ride, Mr. Cross, Clara said, reaching for the heavy door handle. Wait. Gabriel tapped a button on the console. The partition lowered. David, keep the engine running. Yes, boss, the driver grunted. Gabriel opened his door and stepped out into the pouring rain. Clara stared in shock as he walked around the back of the SUV, pulled her door open, and held out an umbrella. Mr. Cross, you don't need to— Get out, Clara, he said quietly, leaving no room for argument. She stepped out onto the wet pavement. He held the umbrella over her head, letting his own expensive wool suit take the brunt of the blowing rain. He didn't walk her to the lobby doors. He walked her through them. The lobby of Clara's building was a depressing affair. The radiator hissed loudly, and the single overhead fluorescent bulb flickered with a dying yellow light. "I can take it from here," Clara said, turning to him. Gabriel ignored her. He looked at the bank of mailboxes, noting the broken locks on half of them. He looked at the stairwell, smelling the damp rot of the carpet. A deep frown etched itself into his face. "Third floor," Clara sighed, realizing he wasn't going to leave. They walked up the stairs in silence. The sound of Gabriel's heavy leather shoes on the creaking wooden steps felt entirely out of place. He was too large, too pristine, too dangerous for this mundane, run-down space. When they reached her door, apartment 3B, Clara dug into her purse for her keys. Her hands were shaking again, not from fear of Arthur, but from the surreal reality of Gabriel Cross standing in her miserable hallway. She found the keys and reached for the deadbolt. Gabriel's hand covered hers. His skin was freezing from the rain, but his grip was solid. He took the keys from her unresisting fingers. He didn't look at her. He looked at the door frame. He ran his thumb over the cheap brass strike plate. "This is a joke," he muttered. "A stiff breeze could kick this door in." "It's what I can afford," Clara said, her chin lifting defensively. "Not all of us skim millions off the top of illegal freight imports." Gabriel paused, the key half inserted into the lock. He turned his head slowly. A ghost of a smirk played at the corner of his mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. "It's not skimming if you own the freight, Miss Bennett." He turned the key. The deadbolt clicked open with a pathetic, hollow sound. He pushed the door open and stepped inside first. Clara stayed in the hallway, watching as he walked into her tiny, cluttered living room. He looked at the worn sofa, the stack of medical bills on the small kitchen table, the fading floral wallpaper. He was doing the math. She hated it. She hated that he was seeing the pathetic reality of her life, the desperate engine that kept her typing his spreadsheets. Gabriel walked back to the doorway. He looked down at her. The cynicism that usually armored her felt remarkably thin under his gaze. "Arthur is a petty, vindictive man," Gabriel said, his voice dropping low in the quiet hallway. "He knows he can't touch me. He knows he can't touch my lieutenants. You are the only civilian in my orbit. I am your secretary. You sit at my right hand," he corrected softly. He stepped closer, crowding her into the doorframe. The smell of the rain and the cedarwood was intoxicating. "In my world, Clara, proximity is power, and proximity is vulnerability. Today, you became both." Clara stared up at him. She wanted to tell him he was crazy. She wanted to tell him she quit. But she thought of the medical bills on the table, and she thought of the heavy, immovable way he had pulled her chair against his. It hadn't felt like a trap. God help her, it had felt like an anchor. "What are you saying?" she whispered. Gabriel reached out. He didn't touch her face. Instead, he gripped the edge of her coat collar, pulling it slightly tighter around her neck, a gesture that was entirely possessive and strangely tender. "I'm saying," Gabriel murmured, his eyes locking onto hers, "that starting tomorrow, you don't take the L train anymore. David picks you up. And tomorrow, I am sending someone to replace this piece of shit door." He let go of her coat, took a step back, and the cold mask of the CEO slid perfectly back into place. "Lock it behind me, Miss Bennett, twice." He turned and walked down the creaking stairs, leaving Clara standing in the doorway, her heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm into the silence of the empty hall. At 6:30 the next morning, the sound of heavy drilling rattled the cheap dental molding of Clara's bedroom ceiling. She woke with a start, her heart kicking against her ribs, instinctively reaching for the heavy brass lamp beside her bed. She crept out of her bedroom, clutching the lamp. The noise wasn't coming from the neighbors, it was coming from her front door. "Hold it steady, Mike. The frame is basically cardboard. We need the reinforced brackets." Clara lowered the lamp, pulling her faded robe tighter across her chest. She unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Two massive men in grey work shirts were standing in her hallway. The older one was holding a power drill. The younger one was holding a solid slab of windowless, industrial-grade steel that looked like it belonged on a bank vault. "Morning, Miss Bennet," the older man said, completely unfazed by her dishevelled state. He tipped an invisible hat. "Boss said you needed an upgrade. We're installing a Class 4 steel core slab with a multi-point locking system. Bullet-resistant, kick-proof, and fire-retardant up to 2 hours. Clara stared at the heavy slab. "I rent this apartment." "Not anymore," the man replied cheerfully, revving the drill. "Mr. Cross bought the building at 4 a.m. Now step back, please. Dust is going to kick up." Clara retreated to her kitchen, her mind entirely blank. She put the kettle on, watching the blue flame of the stove flicker. He bought the building. It was a terrifying flex of capital and control. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was the logistical elimination of a security flaw. She was a spreadsheet macro he was suddenly desperate not to lose. When she walked downstairs an hour later, dressed in her usual unassuming grey skirt and white blouse, David was waiting in the idling Lincoln. He opened the back door for her without a word. The drive to the office was silent, but the city looked different through the bulletproof tint. It looked like a threat. The real change, however, was at the office. Clara worked on the 42nd floor. The outer ring was a bullpen of analysts and logistics coordinators. Usually, when she walked through, it was a chorus of casual nods and requests for office supplies. Today, the floor was dead silent. People didn't look at her. They looked at their monitors, typing with a frantic, forced diligence. The few who did glance her way immediately dropped their eyes. Word had spread. The ecosystem of a criminal syndicate is built entirely on gossip and hierarchy. Yesterday, Clara was the secretary. Today, she was the woman Gabriel Cross had physically pulled into his orbit in front of the Western Capos. She reached her desk. It was an ergonomic setup stationed right outside Gabriel's heavy frosted glass doors. Only it wasn't exactly where she had left it. The heavy mahogany desk had been unbolted and moved exactly 4 feet to the right. It now sat perfectly within the direct line of sight from Gabriel's internal office chair. If his glass door was open even a fraction, he could see her. Clara dropped her bag. She didn't sit down. She pushed open the frosted glass doors without knocking. Gabriel was already at his desk, reviewing a stack of manifestos. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to expose the heavy, corded muscle of his forearms and the faint edge of a burn scar near his left wrist. He didn't look up. "You bought my building," Clara said. Her voice shook just a fraction, betraying the tight grip she was keeping on her panic. "The structural integrity of that complex was a liability," Gabriel said, turning a page. "And the landlord was 2 months behind on his protection payments to the local crew. It was a clean acquisition." "You bought my building," Clara repeated, stepping further into the room. "And you moved my desk." Gabriel finally stopped reading. He set his pen down, perfectly parallel to the edge of the paper. He looked up at her, his pale hazel eyes pinning her in place. "I eliminated blind spots. Do you have a problem with efficiency, Miss Bennet?" "I have a problem with being caged, Mr. Cross. I am not one of your shipments." "No," Gabriel agreed, his voice dropping into that quiet, rumbling register that made the hair on her arms stand up. "If you were a shipment, I'd have you in a warehouse surrounded by armed guards. You're out in the open. Arthur's men followed your train route for 3 days last week. Did you know that?" The air in Clara's lungs vanished. "What?" "They timed your commute. They noted where you stand on the platform." Gabriel stood up slowly. He walked around the desk, his movements deliberate, predatory. He stopped 2 feet away from her. The height difference forced her to tilt her head up to maintain eye contact. "Arthur is looking for leverage," Gabriel said, his tone devoid of emotion, though a muscle feathered in his jaw. "He cannot touch my money, and he cannot touch my lieutenants without starting a war. But a civilian secretary, an accident on the L train is easily arranged." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She thought of the crowded platforms, the heavy rush of the trains, a simple push. "So yes," Gabriel continued, his gaze tracking the pale shock setting into her features. "I bought your building, I moved your desk, and David will drive you. You will stay in my line of sight until Arthur is dealt with. If you consider that a cage, Clara, then learn to appreciate the iron. It's the only thing keeping you breathing." He didn't wait for a response. He turned back to his desk. "Bring me the revised Q3 projections, and cancel my afternoon meetings. We have an errand." Clara stood there for a second longer, staring at the broad line of his shoulders. She was furious. She was terrified. But beneath the cold, cynical dread settling in her stomach, a twisted, undeniable realization took root. He hadn't pulled her chair closer to show Arthur he owned her. He had pulled her closer to physically shield her from the blast radius. The errand was not a shakedown, nor was it a meeting at a shadowy warehouse. At 2 o'clock, the armored navigator pulled up to the sliding glass doors of St. Jude's Medical Center. Clara stared out the window, her heart dropping into her stomach. This was the one place she kept entirely separated from the 42nd floor. This was her anchor to reality. "Why are we here?" Clara asked, her hand freezing on the door handle. Gabriel adjusted his cuffs. "You visit your mother on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 2:30. Today is Thursday. I did not authorize you to look into my personal schedule. I am the CEO, Clara. I authorize myself." He pushed his door open. "Are you getting out? Or are we having another conversation about blind spots?" Clara practically threw herself out of the SUV, anger finally overriding her fear. She marched through the automatic doors, not waiting to see if he was following. The sterile smell of bleach and institutional floor wax hit her instantly. It was the smell of her mother's failing kidneys. It was the smell of her own desperation. She walked quickly towards the elevator banks. Gabriel fell into step beside her. He didn't try to touch her or guide her. He just existed beside her, a heavy, dark mass of bespoke tailoring and suppressed violence amidst the pale blue scrubs and fluorescent lights. They rode the elevator to the 4th floor in silence. When the doors pinged open, Clara stepped out and immediately stopped dead. Sitting in the plastic chairs outside the renal ward were 2 men in dark suits. They weren't reading magazines. They weren't looking at their phones. They were scanning the hallway with clinical, detached precision. Clara recognized the one on the left, Hayes. He was one of Gabriel's fixers, a man who allegedly made a union boss disappear in the foundation of a new high-rise 3 years ago. "What is he doing here?" Clara hissed, turning on Gabriel. "This is a hospital. My mother is in there." "And Arthur knows she is in there," Gabriel replied, unbothered by her rising voice. He gestured slightly with his chin. Hayes caught the movement, nodded once, and went back to scanning the hall. "You brought your enforcers to my mother's dialysis ward." Clara's voice cracked. The exhaustion of the last 48 hours suddenly caught up with her. The spreadsheets, the threats, the deadbolt, the L train. It was bleeding into the one pure thing she had left. "You have no right, Gabriel. You have no right to infect this." It was the first time she had ever used his first name. Gabriel stopped. The icy, corporate facade fractured just for a second. He looked down at her, his eyes darkening, pulling in the harsh fluorescent light. "Infected?" he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. He took a step closer, backing her slightly against the beige cinder-block wall of the corridor. "You think I am the infection, Clara? You think you can compartmentalize your life, work for the devil from 9 to 5, and play the dutiful, innocent daughter on the weekends?" Clara swallowed hard, pressing her back against the cool wall. I do my job. Your job is me, Gabriel said, leaning in. He braced one hand on the wall next to her head. His proximity was suffocating. She could see the faint stubble along his jawline, the pulse beating slow and steady in his neck. Arthur ran a background check on you yesterday. He knows about Sarah Bennett. He knows about the dialysis. He knows you pay for it out of pocket because the insurance only covers 60%. Clara's breath hitched. A cold, suffocating terror clamped down on her chest. Arthur knew about her mother. You think I put Hayes out here to intimidate you? Gabriel asked, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Hayes is out here because if Arthur wants to break you, he won't push you in front of a train. He will walk into the room and turn off your mother's machines, and then he will watch you shatter. Clara closed her eyes. A single hot tear leaked out, tracking down her cheek. She hated it. She hated crying in front of him. She hated that she was powerless in this world of violent men. She felt a rough, warm texture against her cheek. Her eyes snapped open. Gabriel had lifted his hand. He caught the tear with the pad of his thumb, wiping it away with a touch so shockingly gentle it made her gasp. His thumb lingered on her skin, warm and calloused. No one touches what is mine, Clara, he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips before snapping back to her eyes. Not your apartment, not you, and not your mother. Hayes stays. You go in and hold her hand. I will be right here when you come out. He dropped his hand and stepped back, instantly reassembling the impenetrable armor of the boss. Clara stood trembling for a moment. Then she turned and walked into the ward. She didn't look back, but she didn't need to. She could feel the weight of his presence standing guard at the door. He was a monster, yes, but right now, he was her monster. By Friday evening, the tension in the city had escalated from a simmer to a rolling boil. One of Arthur's warehouses on the south side had mysteriously caught fire. In retaliation, a cross-logistics shipment of high-end electronics was hijacked on the interstate. The ecosystem was fracturing. The climax of this silent war was scheduled for 8 o'clock at the Adler Planetarium. It was the annual Mayor's Charity Gala. In Chicago, charity galas were neutral ground where politicians, socialites, and syndicate bosses mingled over champagne to pretend the city was civilized. Clara was not supposed to be there. She was a secretary. But at 5 o'clock, David had delivered a garment bag to her desk. Mr. Cross says to put it on. We leave in an hour, the driver grunted. When Clara unzipped the bag in the executive washroom, she found a dress of midnight blue silk. It was not flashy. There were no sequins or deep plunges. It was elegant, structural, and clearly cost more than her annual salary. It fit her perfectly, hugging the curves of her hips before cascading to the floor. It was armor woven from wealth. When she walked out into the bullpen, Gabriel was waiting. He wore a classic black tuxedo. The severe cut of the jacket accentuated the sheer width of his shoulders. He looked at her, his pale eyes tracking slowly from the hem of the silk up to the messy, elegant twist she had wrestled her hair into. He didn't offer a compliment. He just held out his arm. Keep your phone on you. Do not take a drink from a tray unless you see the bartender pour it. Do not leave my side, Gabriel instructed as they rode the elevator down to the garage. Am I taking minutes tonight, Mr. Cross? Clara asked, her voice dry, though her pulse was racing. Tonight, Clara, you are the message. The planetarium was a sea of glittering lights and murmuring voices. The vast glass windows overlooked the dark expanse of Lake Michigan. Clara walked beside Gabriel, acutely aware of the shift in the room's gravity as he entered. Conversations paused. Eyes darted toward them. Gabriel placed his hand firmly on the small of her back. The heat of his palm bled through the thin silk of her dress. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a brand. It was a physical tether that screamed to every predator in the room. She is in my radius. Touch her, and you die. They moved through the crowd. Gabriel shook hands with councilmen and judges, his demeanor perfectly calibrated. Clara stood at his shoulder, offering polite smiles, feeling like a high-value hostage. It took 40 minutes for Arthur to approach. He swaggered through the crowd, holding a tumbler of scotch, flanked by two men whose ill-fitting tuxedos couldn't hide the bulk of their shoulder holsters. Arthur looked flush, the angry red of his face clashing with his white collar. "Cross!" Arthur boomed, stopping 3 feet away. His eyes immediately snapped to Clara. A greasy, mocking smile spread across his face. "And the lovely secretary. Miss Bennet, isn't it? Moving up in the world? Or just moving into the boss's bed?" Clara stiffened. She kept her face blank, channeling every ounce of Gabriel's icy composure. Gabriel didn't react to the insult. He didn't tighten his grip on Clara, nor did he raise his voice. He took a slow sip of his bourbon. "Arthur," Gabriel said smoothly, "I heard about the fire on the south side, a tragic loss of inventory, faulty wiring, I presume." Arthur's smile vanished. The veins in his neck bulged. "Don't play games with me, Gabriel. You know exactly what happened. That was a line crossed." "Lines get blurred when people forget their place," Gabriel replied softly. He turned his body slightly, angling himself entirely between Arthur and Clara. It was a subtle shift, but in the language of violence, it was deafening. "Like forgetting that 30% is the new standard, or forgetting that my personnel are off limits." "She's a secretary," Arthur sneered, leaning in. "She's a nobody." "She's mine," Gabriel said. The words didn't boom, they didn't echo. They dropped into the space between them like anvils. "And if you look at her again, Arthur, if you even think her name in your head, I won't bother burning down a warehouse. I will burn you down inside your own house. Do we understand each other?" The silence stretched. The ambient noise of the gala seemed to fade entirely. Arthur stared at Gabriel. He was looking for a bluff, a crack in the armor. But Gabriel's eyes were dead. They were the eyes of a man who had already calculated the exact physics of a murder and was simply waiting for the excuse to execute it. Arthur broke first. He swallowed, took a step back, and gave a tight, jerky nod. He turned and walked away, his two shadows following closely behind. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her knees felt weak. She swayed slightly. Instantly, Gabriel's arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. The smell of cedarwood and expensive liquor enveloped her. He was solid stone. "Breathe, Clara," he murmured, his mouth close to her ear. "You just threatened to murder a capo in the middle of a charity gala," she whispered, her hands shaking as she clutched her small evening bag. "I stated a fact in the middle of a charity gala," he corrected, turning her away from the crowd towards the massive glass windows overlooking the lake. "Arthur is a coward. He preys on perceived weakness. Tonight, I proved you are not a weakness." Clara looked out at the black water. The reflection of the room stared back at her. She saw herself, wrapped in midnight silk, held tightly in the grip of the city's most dangerous man. The cynical, practical secretary was gone. She was trapped in the velvet cage he had built around her. "What happens tomorrow, Gabriel?" she asked quietly, not looking at him. "When the gala is over, when the dress comes off, I am still just the woman who types your spreadsheets." Gabriel turned his head. He looked at her profile, his gaze heavy and entirely unreadable. He slowly trailed his hand from her waist, up the line of her spine, sending a shiver through her entire body, until his fingers rested lightly on the nape of her neck. "Tomorrow, Clara," he said, his voice a low, vibrating hum. "You are going to come into my office, sit at your new desk, and realize that you stopped being just my secretary the moment you chose the wrong chair." Monday morning arrived with the brutal clarity of a hangover. The midnight blue silk dress was hanging in Clara's closet, encased in a plastic dry cleaning bag, like a museum exhibit of a life she didn't actually lead. She put on her standard charcoal slacks, a white button-down, and flat shoes. She tied her hair back tight. She was trying to build the armor of a secretary back up, piece by piece. When David picked her up, he opened the door with a slight, respectful nod that hadn't been there last week. When she walked onto the 42nd floor, the silence was different. It wasn't the frantic, terrified typing of Thursday. It was a heavy, deferential hush. The logistics coordinators parted like the Red Sea when she walked to her desk. A fresh, steaming cup of dark roast coffee was already sitting on her blotter. Clara didn't drink it. She didn't know who had made it, and in this ecosystem, you didn't accept favors unless you knew the price. Gabriel's frosted glass doors were open. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the morning gridlock of downtown Chicago. He wore a navy suit, his hands in his pockets. He didn't turn around when she walked in. He didn't have to. The man possessed a radar for her specific frequency. "Close the doors, Clara," he said. She pulled the heavy glass handles. They clicked shut, sealing out the hum of the bullpen. "I need you to run the depreciation models on the transport fleet," Clara said, falling instantly into the cadence of her job. "And the legal team needs your signature on the dockyard leases by noon." Gabriel turned. He looked at her flat shoes, her severe bun, the charcoal slacks. A muscle twitched in his jaw. He walked to his desk, unlocked the bottom right drawer, the one Clara didn't have the key for, and pulled out a thick, black, leather-bound ledger. He tossed it onto the center of the mahogany desk. It hit the wood with a heavy thud. "Leave the leases," Gabriel said, leaning against the edge of his desk and crossing his arms. "Sit down." Clara looked at the ledger, then at the empty leather chair opposite his desk. She sat. "Open it," he instructed. She reached out. Her fingers hesitated on the cover. A ledger in a legitimate business was a record. A ledger in Gabriel Cross's business was a confession. She flipped the heavy cover open. The pages were filled with handwritten entries in black ink. It wasn't shipping manifests or depreciation models. It was a terrifyingly meticulous accounting of bribes, political campaign contributions, shell company holdings, and offshore wire transfers. It was the skeleton of the Western syndicates. It was enough evidence to put Gabriel and everyone associated with him in federal prison for 3 consecutive lifetimes. Clara pulled her hands back as if the paper had burned her. She looked up at Gabriel. Her chest felt tight. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because Arthur's move at the gala wasn't just a temper tantrum," Gabriel said calmly. "It was a stress test. He is bleeding money, Clara. The Fed seized his imports in Baltimore last month. He is drowning, and when a rat drowns, it thrashes. He is looking for a buyout or a hostile takeover. What does this have to do with me looking at your private books?" Gabriel pushed off the desk and crouched down beside her chair. He was too close, his broad shoulders crowding her vision, the scent of cedarwood and clean linen cutting through the sterile office air. He reached out and tapped a specific column on the open page. "Look at the numbers, Clara. You're the best numbers person I have. Look at them." She forced herself to focus. She tracked the columns. The offshore accounts were structured through an intricate web of holding companies. But the routing numbers followed a distinct, repeating, algorithmic pattern. Clara's analytical mind took over, bypassing her panic. "They're funneled through a central trust," she murmured, tracing the line with her pen. "And the trust disperses it back into domestic real estate. It's clean, it's brilliant, but—" She frowned, flipping back a page, then forward. "But what?" Gabriel prompted, his voice a low, encouraging rumble. "There's a leak," Clara said, her eyes widening. She tapped a recurring figure. "Here, every 14 days. A fractional percentage is being diverted before it hits the trust. It's disguised as an administrative fee, but the routing sequence is slightly altered. Someone inside your accounting firm is skimming off the top. Gabriel stared at her. A slow, dark satisfaction settled into his pale eyes. Yes, you knew. I suspected, Gabriel corrected, standing back up. I needed you to confirm it. The firm is owned by Arthur's brother-in-law. Clara closed the ledger sharply. Gabriel, you just made me an accomplice to federal racketeering. If the FBI raids this office, I can't plead ignorance anymore. If the FBI raids this office, you will have a first-class ticket to Geneva and a bank account with 7 figures before they even breach the lobby, Gabriel said, completely unfazed. He walked back to the window. But they won't, because you're going to fix the leak. Clara stood up, her pulse drumming in her ears. I am a secretary. I type schedules. I order your lunch. Gabriel spun around. The corporate mask finally slipped, revealing the raw, possessive intensity beneath. He crossed the room in 3 strides, backing her up against the edge of the desk. He gripped her upper arms, not hard enough to bruise, but firm enough to render her entirely immobile. You haven't been a secretary since the day you sat in my boardroom and refused to flinch when a capo slammed his fist on my table, Gabriel snapped. His voice was a harsh whisper, vibrating with suppressed energy. You are brilliant. You are cold when you need to be. You see the board, Clara. You just refuse to play the game because you are terrified of getting blood on your hands. I'm terrified of ending up dead, she fired back, her own voice rising, dropping the professional restraint. She looked up at him, her chest heaving. I am trying to keep my mother alive. I am trying to survive you. Gabriel's grip softened. His thumbs brushed lightly against the cotton of her sleeves. He looked down at her face, tracing the lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the defiant set of her jaw. You don't need to survive me, Clara, he murmured, the anger draining out of him, replaced by a heavy, dangerous vulnerability. You are the only thing in this city I am trying to keep alive. He let go of her arms, picked up the ledger, and placed it gently into her hands. Fix the routing numbers, he said quietly. Cut Arthur's blood supply off completely. By Friday, I want him starved. Clara looked down at the black leather in her hands. It was the weight of an empire. She looked back up at Gabriel. He wasn't ordering her. He was handing her the gun. She took a slow, deep breath, burying the terrified civilian, and let the cynical, pragmatic survivor take the wheel. I'll need unrestricted access to the server room, she said, her voice deadpan. And I'm taking a 2-hour lunch for the hospital today. David drives. A faint, genuine smile broke across Gabriel's face. It made him look devastatingly human. Take 3 hours, Miss Bennett. By Thursday evening, Arthur was starved. Clara had rerouted the offshore shell companies with surgical precision, trapping Arthur's stolen capital in a frozen escrow account in the Caymans. She did it silently, typing away at her new desk, while Gabriel conducted business in his office, with the doors wide open. They didn't speak about it. They didn't need to. The shift in power was palpable in the air between them. At 7 p.m., the 42nd floor was empty. Clara packed her laptop into her leather tote. Gabriel walked out of his office, shrugging into his charcoal overcoat. Ready? He asked. Yes. They rode the private elevator down to the subterranean parking garage. The garage was a concrete cavern, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of sodium vapor lights. The air smelled of damp cement and exhaust. David was standing by the armored Lincoln, his hands clasped casually in front of him. The elevator doors pinged open. Clara stepped out first, digging in her purse for her lip balm. Gabriel was a half step behind her. Everything happened in a fraction of a second. David didn't open the door. He suddenly pitched forward, a sickening red mist spraying against the black-tinted glass of the SUV. The sharp, cracking echo of a suppressed gunshot bounced off the concrete pillars. Clara froze, her brain failing to process the physics of a man dying in front of her. "Down!" Gabriel roared. He didn't grab her arm. He hit her waist with the force of a freight train, tackling her hard onto the oily concrete floor, just as the rear window of a parked delivery van, 50 feet away, shattered outward. Automatic gunfire erupted, deafening and chaotic, shredding the space where they had been standing a microsecond before. The concrete exploded into dust around them. Clara couldn't breathe. The air was knocked out of her lungs. Gabriel was entirely on top of her, crushing her beneath his heavy frame. He wasn't wearing body armor. He was using his own flesh and bone to shield her. "Gabriel," Clara choked out, the smell of cordite and burned rubber filling her nose. "Stay flat. Do not close your eyes," he ordered, his voice remarkably steady despite the chaos. He rolled slightly off her, pinning her to the floor with one arm while drawing a sleek, matte black Sig Sauer from his shoulder holster with his free hand. 3 men piled out of the back of the delivery van. They wore tactical vests and ski masks, Arthur's final desperate play. If he couldn't have the money, he would cut off the head of the snake. Gabriel didn't spray and pray. He moved with a cold, terrifying mechanical efficiency. He pushed himself up onto one knee, exposing his torso to the line of fire. He fired twice. The first man dropped, his knee shattering, followed instantly by a bullet to the throat. The second man swung his rifle toward Gabriel. Clara screamed, covering her ears as Gabriel fired again. The second man's head snapped back, a spray of red painting the concrete pillar behind him. The third man panicked. He dropped his weapon and turned to run back toward the ramp. Gabriel stood up fully. The firing stopped. The sudden silence in the garage was deafening, broken only by the harsh ringing in Clara's ears and the dripping of fluids from the shredded Lincoln. Gabriel didn't chase the running man. He simply raised his arm, aligned the sights, and pulled the trigger once. The third man collapsed 50 feet away, a lifeless heap on the ramp. It was over in less than 30 seconds. Clara lay on the concrete, trembling violently. Her palms were scraped and bleeding from the fall. She couldn't move. She just stared at the bodies, the blood pooling dark and thick under the yellow lights. Gabriel holstered his weapon. He didn't check the bodies. He turned immediately back to Clara. The cold, mechanical killer vanished, replaced by something frantic. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands running rapidly over her arms, her shoulders, her neck, searching for blood that wasn't his own. "Clara, Clara, look at me." She couldn't. She was staring at David's body slumped against the tire of the SUV. He had driven her to the hospital. He had bought her a coffee yesterday. Gabriel grabbed her face with both hands, forcing her to look at him. His pale hazel eyes were wild, searching hers. He had blood splattered across the crisp white collar of his shirt. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his thumbs pressing hard into her jawline to ground her. "Talk to me. Are you hit?" "No," she whispered, her voice a fragile, broken thing. I'm okay." Gabriel let out a ragged, shuddering breath. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, his forehead dropping to rest against hers. His hands were shaking. Gabriel Cross, the untouchable, emotionless machine, was shaking. "I've got you," he breathed against her skin. "I've got you." He pulled away, wrapping his arms around her, and hoisted her off the cold floor. He didn't let her walk. He carried her like a child, pressing her face into the curve of his neck so she wouldn't have to look at the carnage as he walked them toward the secondary, secure stairwell. Clara clung to his lapels, burying her face in the scent of cedarwood and gunpowder. She was crying now, silent, heaving sobs. But as she held onto the man who had just slaughtered 3 people with zero hesitation, the most terrifying realization hit her. She wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of what she would have done if one of those bullets had hit him instead. The safe house was a penthouse in the Gold Coast, completely off the books, registered to one of the shell companies Clara had restructured. It was sterile, modern, and wrapped in floor-to-ceiling bulletproof glass that overlooked the dark, churning waters of Lake Michigan. Gabriel set her down on the edge of a massive leather sofa. He immediately went to the kitchen and returned with a first aid kit and a glass of neat whiskey. "Drink it," he ordered, pressing the heavy crystal glass into her trembling hands. Clara took a sip. The alcohol burned down her throat, cutting through the shock. Gabriel pulled up a heavy ottoman, sitting directly in front of her. He took her hands, gently prying the glass away and setting it on the coffee table. He opened the kit, poured antiseptic onto a gauze pad, and began to clean the scrapes on her palms. He moved with agonizing gentleness. The contrast between the hands that had executed 3 men an hour ago and the hands currently cleaning her minor wounds was staggering. "Arthur is dead," Gabriel said quietly, not looking up from her palm. Clara flinched. "Hayes hit his compound 10 minutes after the garage ambush," Gabriel continued, his voice devoid of emotion. It was a weather report. "The Western syndicates are fractured. My lieutenants are absorbing their territory tonight. The war is over." He finished cleaning her hands and wrapped a small bandage around the deepest scrape on her wrist. He finally looked up at her. The adrenaline had faded, leaving him looking hollowed out and unspeakably tired. Gabriel reached into the inside pocket of his ruined jacket. He pulled out a thick, manila envelope and placed it on her lap. "What is this?" Clara asked, her voice raspy. "A new social security number, a passport, title to a house in Zurich, and the access codes to a numbered Swiss bank account containing $5 million, Gabriel said. He didn't blink. He didn't look away. "Your mother's medical transfer has already been arranged. She will fly out on a private medevac plane tomorrow morning. You will be on it." Clara stared at the envelope. It was the out. It was everything she had ever worked for, neatly packaged. Freedom. Safety. "Why?" she whispered, clutching the edges of the envelope. Gabriel stood up. He walked over to the glass windows, turning his back to her. "Because I was wrong, Clara. I thought I could build a cage strong enough to keep the wolves out. But the wolves are inside the house. I pulled you into the line of fire to prove a point, and today you almost died for it." He bowed his head, resting his hand against the cold glass. "Take the money. Take your mother. Go somewhere clean, where people don't bleed on the concrete." Clara looked down at the envelope. It was heavy. It was a lifeline. She thought about the L train. She thought about the medical bills, the cheap deadbolt, the smell of dialysis fluid. She thought about David. Then she thought about Gabriel. She thought about him standing in her rundown hallway, looking at her broken lock. She thought about his thumb catching her tear in the hospital corridor. She thought about the crushing weight of his body pressing her into the floor, taking the bullets meant for her. Clara stood up. Her legs were shaky, but she found her balance. She walked over to the coffee table and dropped the envelope. It landed with a soft, final thud next to the whiskey glass. She walked across the room, her flat shoes silent on the hardwood floor. She stopped directly behind Gabriel. She reached out and wrapped her arms around his waist from behind, pressing her cheek against the broad, rigid line of his back. Gabriel went completely still. He stopped breathing. "I don't want Zurich," Clara said softly, her voice steadying. "I don't speak German and I hate the cold." Gabriel slowly turned around within her arms. He looked down at her, his expression a fractured mix of disbelief and a desperate, terrifying hope. "Clara, you saw what I am tonight. You saw what this life is. If you stay, you can never go back to the spreadsheets. You are a target. You are my greatest liability. I am your greatest asset," Clara corrected, looking up into his pale eyes. The cynicism was gone. In its place was a hard, diamond-like clarity. "Arthur is gone, but there will be another Arthur. There will always be another Arthur, and you need someone who can track the routing numbers, fix the leaks, and see the board." Gabriel stared at her. Slowly he reached up, tangling his hands in her messy hair, cupping her face. "You understand what you are choosing. You understand what this makes you?" "I understand," Clara whispered. "I choose the iron cage, as long as you are the one locking the door." Gabriel let out a ragged breath, the last vestige of his control snapping. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't gentle, and it wasn't safe. It was desperate, bruising, and deeply possessive, a sealing of a pact. Clara kissed him back with equal ferocity, her hands gripping his shoulders, anchoring herself to the monster she had chosen to love. A week later, the boardroom on the 42nd floor was packed. The rain was beating against the glass. The new capos, the ones who had absorbed Arthur's territory, sat around the long oak table. They were nervous. They kept their voices low, their eyes darting around the room. Gabriel sat at the head of the table. He wore a charcoal suit, perfectly tailored. His pale hazel eyes were flat, assessing the structural weaknesses of the men in front of him. The heavy glass doors opened. The room went silent. Clara walked in. She wasn't carrying a tablet. She wasn't wearing a grey pencil skirt. She wore a tailored black blazer and trousers, her posture immaculate. She walked toward the head of the table. There was the chair to Gabriel's left, the safe chair, pulled out 3 feet away, and there was the chair to his right, the focal point, the drop zone. Clara didn't hesitate. She walked past the safe chair. She pulled out the heavy leather chair directly flush against Gabriel's right side. She sat down, her armrest touching his. Gabriel didn't look at her, but a faint ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. He leaned back, resting his forearm on the table, bridging the tiny gap between them. "As I was saying, gentlemen," Gabriel rumbled, his voice commanding the room, "the new revenue split is 40%, non-negotiable." No one slammed a fist on the table. No one argued. They just looked at Gabriel, and then they looked at the woman sitting confidently in the line of fire, right beside him. Sometimes the safest place to hide is right beside the monster. Clara walked into that boardroom as a secretary, but she walked out as a queen, trading her spreadsheets for the heavy, bloody crown of the syndicate. Gabriel built the cage, but Clara chose to turn the key. "Thank you for riding out this intense, high-stakes romance with us. If you loved this deep dive into loyalty, power, and dangerous love, smash that like button and share this story with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe for more gripping mafia dramas. Drop a comment below. Would you have taken the envelope to Zurich, or would you take the chair beside him? Let me know.